Unit 10, Shifting International Relations and the End of the Postwar Era. By the end of the postwar era, we mean the era in which the United States really and the Soviet Union were the two superpowers in the world. And there was essentially a bipolar world. But by 1969, the whole structure of international relations had changed considerably. And both the United States and the Soviet Union had declined in absolute terms and in relative terms. The arms race in the Cold War used enormous resources from both countries. You know, both countries were major industrial powers. They suffered a great deal because of that Cold War. In addition, the Vietnam War sapped a lot of American strength and resources, and also American prestige as well. And so the United States was no longer top dog, and the Soviet Union was no longer even second top dog. They were having severe internal economic problems, as was the United States. American exports were declining. Nixon instituted a whole series of policies, took the United States off of the gold standard, and a couple of major changes in the international economy. At the same time, there was a growing hostility between communist China and communist Russia. We've already seen the difference in the ideological changes in those two countries. And so both of those countries really became active hostile enemies to the point of actually a shooting war that erupted over the Sino-Soviet border. And so Nixon saw this as an opportunity. Now, Nixon came to power in 1968 in the middle of the turmoil over Vietnam. And he promised to reunite the country. We can describe Nixon as a pragmatic conservative, as a moderate Republican, not an extreme conservative. His Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. Kissinger actually served as National Security Council Director and also as Secretary of State, and was one of the most influential Secretaries of State in American history. He was a follower of the realist policy. Remember Teddy Roosevelt and this whole idea that it's basically power that promotes international relations. And so Kissinger was a realist. Kissinger really believed that power politics was what drove the world. So he really didn't have much of a consideration for Latin America. He had really no consideration for Africa at all, and not even too much consideration for major countries like India. At this particular time, the United States' relations with India were very tense and very negative, and Washington viewed Pakistan in a very favorable light, whereas today it's kind of the other way around. But both Nixon and Kissinger hated and despised India's Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, because she didn't mind criticizing the United States over Vietnam. She was critical of American culture and American society. She, like the other leaders of India, had been educated by the British and really kind of felt American culture was kind of inferior. And so both Kissinger and Nixon, in their private White House conversations, which have all been taped, referred to Madam Indira Gandhi as a whore and a bitch and a witch. They called her all kinds of really nasty names in their private conversations. And so the United States really had a very tense relationship with India. Regarding Chile, another problem was Salvador Allende. He was a Marxist. He was the only Marxist in Latin American history to be elected in a democratic election. He won not a majority, he won a plurality of the vote, but nevertheless, it was clear, even to many members of the Chilean military, that the people wanted Allende. He was a democratic leader, he was respected, but of course there was a hardcore of conservative Chileans who hated him because of his communism. And so the United States, as they did with Juan Bosch and João Goulart, let it be known that they didn't like him, and that they wanted to destabilize him. So the United States sent money to Allende's opponents, and finally in 1973, Allende was overthrown in a bloody coup in which several thousand of his supporters just disappeared. Mostly young student radicals were just taken out and killed. And so Kissinger has been blamed for that by many people, for instigating that revolution that resulted in the mass murder of many thousands of Chileans. But the real foreign policy coup for Nixon and Kissinger was a détente with China. Now, Nixon and Kissinger's style was very secretive. They didn't let people know much about what they were doing. And so Kissinger began secretly to make overtures to China, but the Chinese also were a little bit more open. They sent a ping-pong team, table tennis team to the United States, which prompted the press to label it as ping-pong diplomacy. And then Nixon took a trip to China secretly, and then finally Nixon took, of course, a public trip to China, and Nixon wanted to make sure that no Democrats were in on this. He didn't want the Democrats to steal his prestige and his thunder. He wanted to promote himself as a world leader of peace. Nixon and Kissinger weren't interested in world peace. They were realists. They believed in realpolitik. And their job was to help the United States economically in a time of economic recession, and to find markets for American businesses, and to exploit the growing division between the Russians and the Chinese. So that was really Nixon's motive for going to China and establishing relationships. But by the end of the 1970s, even after Nixon was impeached and his position was taken over by Gerald Ford, the Cold War was coming to an end, was winding down. There were still sources of hostility. There were still areas where the great powers, Russia and the United States, still confronted each other, but the confrontations were lessening. And as we shall see in the next unit, Carter did a great deal to promote the idea of human rights and to promote the idea of détente, although there were still sources of conflict and support. But certainly the big, most important event of the Nixon administration was the détente and the establishment of relationships with China.